Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Great War. Get into the second part here. We're going to talk about some pretty crazy things. The war progressing or regressing, depending on how you view war, um, and expanding. We take a look at how many of these colonial peoples came in to fight in this conflict. We also take a look at something that happens in Russia, the Russian Revolution, and things begin to fall apart there with the rise of the Soviet Union, and Russia pulls out of the war, but we also then get the U.S. into the war in this segment. And then we finish by talking about the Treaty of Versailles, which essentially lays the foundation for, you guessed it, another world war. But wait, I thought this was the war to end all wars. Okay, so I mean, you might as well get Italy into the conflict. So the Italians, they actually were partners in the Triple Alliance, which is what Germany and Austria, with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But once the war started, they stayed neutral. It was kind of the Triple Alliance was kind of thought of as a defensive alliance anyway, so the Italians kind of viewed it that way. Plus, they wanted to get some spoils. So basically, once the war got underway, they ended up joining up through some secret treaties with the Allies instead, Britain and France. And then, as you can see, they attack Austria-Hungary. So that clearly puts them into the Allied power forces. And you have to understand, I mean, this conflict is more than just in Europe. I know that we talked about the Western Front and how many soldiers were there, but the war really is a global war, at least certainly more of a world war than any war previously. And you see here the fighting in the Middle East. Remember the Ottoman Empire, they choose the wrong side. They join with the Central Powers. And basically, out of this, they had controlled much of the Middle East. Now, of course, the British had their eyes set on the Middle East, had Russia for that matter, for since the middle of the 19th century. And then especially once oil became, the petroleum revolution of the 1890s, early 1900s, the Middle East became even more popular. So you see Britain and their guy, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who was a British archaeologist, very amazing writer. He was a diplomat. He was in the army. But T.E. Lawrence, I guess he was the British Indiana Jones. But he helps to kind of incite this Arab rebellion, Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, because that's what the British want. They want this kind of chaos there to drive out the Ottomans. The British and the French and the Russians, for that matter, for decades, maybe even 100 years up to this point, had been biting off chunks of the Ottoman Empire, pushing it around. And World War I, of course, will be the death knell for the Ottoman Empire. And this is just kind of one of the final nails being driven into the coffin that is the Ottoman Empire, with the Arab revolt that is fired up with T.E. Lawrence, the archaeologist. Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, so there is a major naval battle during this conflict. Now recall that you have German U-boats all over the Atlantic Ocean. As a matter of fact, that's what's going to pull the U.S. into the war, is unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany. No, not the Lusitania. That is not what pulls the U.S. into the war. I don't care what your coach/teacher told you. What pulls the U.S. into the war is the unrestricted submarine warfare. But we'll get back to that later. But in terms of naval warfare, so you have that. These submarines all across the Atlantic sinking ships, German submarine sinking Allied ships. But you also have one of the biggest battles. I think it's still the biggest battle in world history at Jutland. And you can see the arrow there that kind of gives it away. But at Jutland, the British take on the German Navy. And you have to remember that, both of these sides had been building up their armaments. There was an arms race between these two for quite some time. Well, it all culminates in this huge battle of Jutland off the coast there of Denmark. And invariably, the British win the thing. There's a good little short clip there. It's only a few minutes that you see down there on the bottom from the Smithsonian channel. Give that a look. It is interesting, but kind of gives the dynamics of the battle and how ships moved around and things like that. But nonetheless, the key with this battle, I mean, really, there's not going to be another major naval battle in the remainder of the war, and this is in 1916. And basically, what this is going to allow is for the British to have a massive blockade and really hinder the shipment of supplies into Germany for much of the war. And this is just detailing the Western Front, so you can see the mess on the Western Front. I mean, just look at the years, right? You see 1914, right? Looking at the map on your right, you see 1914 August, right? Going to Brussels, and then you see March 1918. In 1914, going back and forth, 1916 at Verdun, right? So just over the course of these 4 years, you can see how basically the front on the Western Front barely even moved at the cost of millions killed. It's just tragic what happens here on this Western Front. But in terms of the Great War, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about this here in a second, but overall it becomes a total war, right? A total war is one in which countries dedicate the entirety of their economy, their society, everything goes toward the war. World War I will be a total war for the European players in this conflict. It won't be for the United States. World War II will be a total war for the United States. But not World War I. But regardless, once you start dedicating so many material resources, infrastructure, civilian populations to war, well, that becomes a kind of I guess an indicator to the enemy that, okay, to win this conflict, not only do we have to take out the enemy army, we have to take out the enemy's cities and towns where they have their factories and their means of production. So because it's a total war, and this is going to be the future of warfare, at least for World War II as well, is you're going to see many more civilian deaths than you would have seen in previous wars. You have some countries that recruit, a lot of women to serve in auxiliary units. You see one woman who fought for the Serbians, national hero. But nonetheless, in these European countries, and to an extent in the U.S., not nearly what it was in Europe, women begin to replace men, in occupations, like in factories making munitions. But at the same time, you also have massive food shortages. And we talked about that blockade of Britain over Germany. Now, historians still debate, the effectiveness of the blockade, blah, blah, blah. Nonetheless, the blockade does have a pretty big effect to the point where the Germans are eating loaves of bread, but, it's probably like 70% sawdust or something like that. So tasty. So basically, once you start having these food shortages, especially in places like Germany, you're going to see these women who, are back in the homeland going to begin to rebel. I mean, when a mother cannot feed her child, she's going to react, right? So you really see these states internally, these countries fighting in this conflict beginning to kind of fall apart at the seams internally, which is not good for building morale for a conflict. And really by 1918, I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, you got well over 8 million casualties, or dead rather, and certainly another 20 million wounded at least, and civilians being bombed from the air. By 1918, you have some aircraft that can carry limited ordnance, hand grenades, things like that. You have food shortages. You have disease beginning to spread. The Great Flu Pandemic, there's nothing great about it other than it's just huge. The flu pandemic breaks out in the last year of this conflict as well, and is going to wipe out, we still don't know to this day, but probably around 50 million people around the globe just in about a year and a half, 2 years. But nonetheless, you can see here some French women helping with the war effort. And this is going to become part of this argument amongst women to say that, look, I mean, if we can fill in and work in your factories just like, talking to the men, I guess, we can work in your factories and do the same work, then why on earth do we not have the same rights? Hello? So really, a lot of women are able to gain some traction from this and begin to press for things like, the right to vote. I mean, how ridiculous is that? It takes until 1919 just in the United States, speaking here. I know I said French munition factory, which is true, but also in the United States, women don't get the right to vote until 1919. but nonetheless, they can use the war for this, right? Because once the U.S. joins the war, Woodrow Wilson's going to say, well, we need to make the world safe for democracy. And some of these suffrage leaders like Alice Paul are going to say, oh, really? You're going to make the world safe for democracy? Well, maybe you should start at home. But nonetheless, you can check out a pretty cool clip down there on the bottom from the History Channel. World War I, the home front. It's kind of cool. I'm sorry, it's not the History Channel. It's History Needs You. But it's World War I, the home front. It's a pretty good little clip. Okay, so total war. So basically, we're talking about total mobilization of all resources, right? Resources are to go toward war. Now, like I said, the U.S. doesn't do this during World War I. They will during World War II, but the Europeans certainly do. They have to. And we're talking about, factories where if they're making, aluminum cans for food, now they're making bullets, right? So factories totally turn over whatever it was they were making for the consuming or consumer public, and now they're making goods for the war to help win the conflict. And of course, you have millions of Europeans being drafted, non-European men being drafted as well, or called up to the conflict. Remember, the Europeans have these colonies all over the place. So you're going to have, soldiers from India fighting over in Europe. You're going to have soldiers from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, right? And geez, Africa. I mean, numerous soldiers from Africa on both sides, which we'll see a little bit more of here in a second. And of course, as we pointed out, women for industrial production at home. But what this also leads to is these populations have been mobilized, right? We talked about the mobilization of soldiers, but you're also now mobilizing your public. You're mobilizing your civilians and saying, hey, let's go. We're at war. Even if we're not literally in the war, we're still at war, right? We're helping the cause. So you're mobilizing all of these people, but a lot of these people are going to want to be compensated for what they sacrificed, right? Including soldiers returning home who are terribly wounded and suffer quite a bit post-war. But also, like we pointed out earlier, people who help in the war effort, like women, who feel like, hey, if we can do this, why can't we get the right to vote or have some respect in society? Totally fair. But nonetheless, so we get participation for people outside of Europe, as we pointed out. And World War I, II really contributes to the rise in importance of mass production. Now, mass production had really initiated with Henry Ford up in Michigan with his conveyor belt, what do you call that, assembly line. But nonetheless, with the Great War, they see the need for mass producing these goods. So because of this, mass production really becomes the way of the world, the way of economic production, these huge amounts of goods. And, of course, then during the war, that means infrastructure and industry now becomes a target for these sides. So then what that also means is that governments have to be rather robust in order to win this kind of conflict. So that means you're going to see the role and size of government expand greatly. You need a lot of leadership and a lot of organization at the political, governmental level in order to really organize and win a conflict. Now here you see some images of some colonial peoples fighting in this conflict. You can see there on the top some Indian soldiers coming out of India fighting for the British. 75,000 Indian soldiers, almost, it was like 74,200, something like that, die in this conflict fighting on the British side. Now, very soon, India is going to be falling into its own breakaway from Britain, of course, with Gandhi and the movement toward Indian independence, but still got a little ways to go from this, I guess. But nonetheless, you look there on the bottom and you see some African troops from modern-day Tanzania, or what they would have called back then German East Africa, fighting on the German side. So this is a world war with these colonial imperial powers from Europe, using these people to further the various European countries' cause. And, I mean, this thing does indeed reach across continents, right? The Ottoman Empire is going to get in this thing. They're going to battle with the British and technically with New Zealanders and Australians. The war is going to stretch into Iraq, modern-day Iraq, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus Mountains. So this conflict is all over. And then, at the same time, you have this terrible massacre that's going to be carried out by the Ottomans. They're going to massacre about 1 to 1.5 million ethnic Armenians over the course of about 5 or 6 years, and it's right in the midst of this conflict. And not only that, but as Britain and France and these other countries, conscript, forced to serve, draft millions of these soldiers, well, not all of them are just going to say, okay, fine, we'll do it, right? So you are going to get some rebellion in some of these places from these people that say, hey, why, someone from Africa, Sudan, for example, why should they fight for Britain? So that definitely becomes a big part of this conflict, a conflict within. And the war overall, Russia is going to be destroyed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire destroyed. The Ottoman Empire destroyed. So this is a war that is going to not only lead to the defeat of countries, but to the total dismemberment, destruction of entire empires. And speaking of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka Vladimir Lenin. These guys love to take on their cute little revolutionary names. Joseph Saakashvili, Joe Stalin. Actually, it's probably for the better that they did. It makes it a lot easier to spell. But anyway, so in Russia, they're also fighting in this conflict over on the Eastern Front, and things are not going well for Russia at all. Their troops are poorly supplied. They don't have enough weapons, clothing, food, ammo, all of that stuff. And in the meantime, their population is starving. Russia never really did industrialize. They never really caught up with these other industrial powers, but yet Russia is just this massive, massive place. But nonetheless, what we start to see is, all these uprisings across Russia. And frankly, they started all the way back in the early 1900s, or you go even back, I guess, 100 years before that to the Decemberists, but let's not do that. With 1905, with Bloody Sunday, the protests outside of the Tsar's Winter Palace where people were just massacred. But, increasingly people are they're tired of the poor rule of the Tsar. By the time we're into the 19 teens, Russia is still pretty much a feudalistic country. It's just been left behind. So essentially, what's going to happen is the Tsar is overthrown in March of 1917. When he's overthrown, a provisional government, temporary government is set up under this guy Kerensky. The problem is, a big reason why the people were protesting, the Russian people, a couple of reasons. Number one, they wanted food. Number two, they wanted to be able to own their own land. You had these wealthy, noblesque people, the kulaks, who controlled the landed wealth in Russia. Now, of course, they didn't control the factories or anything like that because, well, they didn't exist, but they did control the land, and people wanted their own land. But the other big thing they wanted was they wanted to get Russia out of the war. They were tired of the Tsar focusing on the war and not on feeding his own people, which is probably fair. So essentially what happens, though, is this provisional government continues fighting in the conflict. Well, there's a rising group of communists and Marxists who call themselves Bolsheviks, which is a Russian term for majority. And they have some alternate plans for Russia. And essentially the Bolsheviks, by October, November of 1917, are going to overthrow the provisional government, and they will install their own government under the leadership of the guy you see to your right there, Vladimir Lenin. And essentially, the idea is that they're going to, take over for the earlier bourgeois revolution. Now, there's some problems here, right? Russia pretty much is still in this feudalistic stage. But, Karl Marx said that after feudalism, you have to have the rise of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie elites create the capitalist mode of production. And within the capitalist mode, they start exploiting workers, and this could be a rather long process, right? But that never really happened in Russia. And, a guy like Lenin, who was pretty devout Marxist, as opposed to some of the guys who are going to come after him, like Stalin, Lenin being a devout Marxist, he understood this. But for him, because there's no bourgeois capitalist class to overthrow, basically what he says is, okay, well, we need professional revolutionaries like Lenin, like Trotsky, not Stalin. Lenin thought Stalin was a twit. But, they need these guys to come in, and they'll lead this Marxist revolution. And Lenin actually has a NEP, New Economic Plan, where he actually tries to let classes gain a little bit of wealth to kind of create this somewhat artificial bourgeois class, the bourgeoisie, I guess, to eventually overthrow them. And basically, these Bolsheviks that were going to come in, the Tsar and his family are taken captive. They're held down in Yekaterinburg, Russia. And we'll talk about the family here in a second, because there's more behind the scenes than that. But nonetheless, what this new Soviet system is going to be, first of all, what Lenin's going to do is he's going to pull Russia out of the war. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And you can see there, if you look to the west, the left of your screen there, you can see where the new line is going to be drawn. Basically, they just ceded all of that land to the Germans. Lenin's like, all right, Germany, you want this land here. We need to get to the Marxist experiment here and get out of the war. So basically, they pull out of the war rather abruptly, much to the cheer of the Germans, who can now focus on the Western Front, right? To the chagrin, I guess, of the British and the French, but there's somebody else who has also joined the war at this point. Nonetheless, what the Soviets, or rather what the communists do, the Bolsheviks do, is they set up these Soviets. Basically, the Soviet Union, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was 17 states, basically. And they set up these Soviets, or these councils, who were representatives from the worker class, from soldiers all across Russia. And, Russia's this huge place. So the idea was that, this could be localized organization for politics and political activity, right? And so that so that the main central government back in Moscow knows, they move it back to Moscow, knows what's going on across the country and can stay informed. Now, eventually, it's going to lead to things like collectivization and that kind of tragedy. But nonetheless, this was the original system that they set up. So a big reason why things were falling apart was the guy you see up there in your top right, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was this mad Siberian monk, mad as in crazy lunatic, and he made his way to Petrograd, the capital where the Tsar and his family was located. But at this point, the Tsar actually has decided to go to the front lines to try to lead the troops, even though the Tsar is absolutely clueless, and he's not going to be able to lead troops anywhere, anytime, any place. And it's not like he's out on the battlefield or anything like that. He's like, in a train car way back from the front line. But anyway, Rasputin comes in, and is invited into the royal palace, supposedly because he maybe has these healing powers, because the Tsar's son Alexei has hemophilia, and supposedly Rasputin can do some kind of whatever with this kid, magic, and help save the kid. Well, it turns out that for whatever reason, the kid was what they thought was on his deathbed. Rasputin goes in, does something, and all of a sudden the kid seems to be okay. Well, that's enough for the Tsarina, the Tsar's wife, to say, "Whoa, this Rasputin guy, he's wow, okay, he can stick around." Well, Rasputin's a pretty wild dude. As you can tell, he's a real looker there. Just kidding, but he's able to make really close friends with pretty much all the women at the royal palace and estate. People were just absolutely attracted to this guy, and he was a total slob. Like, he would sit at the dinner table and eat food with his bare fingers, like nasty greasy meats, and get it all stuck in his beard, and he would laugh aloud, and just a really gross dude. Didn't take very many baths, so he had a pretty nice stink to him. But anyway, so you have to keep in mind that around Russia at the same time, you got millions of people starving to death. And when news comes out of Rasputin, in the newspapers of Rasputin having all this influence and living it up in the royal palace and doing things like going out to bars, dancing, and having a good old time, yucking it up, talking about stories from the royal palace and how this is how they live while everybody else starves. Basically, the nobles around the area, around the palace, basically decide that they're just going to kill this guy. And there's a long, convoluted story with that, but basically that's what they do, and he's taken out. But the point being is that, uh, the whole place is falling apart. Russia's falling apart. And, you have the Tsarina worried about bringing in somebody like Rasputin to heal her kid, which, of course she's worried about her child. But at the same time, this whole story in the minds of the Russian people plays into this, that the royal family doesn't really care about the people, that they're out of touch, which is probably fair, that they're definitely out of touch. So you see protests like you see there over on the far left, and Russia is just totally falling apart. So here's the thing. So basically, once Lenin and the Bolsheviks take over, the Tsar and his family are rounded up. They're sent to Yekaterinburg, and they're held captive there. I don't recall for how long, but eventually a call comes in to the Soviets, the communists guarding them, and they're told basically just to kill the royal family. Sadly, they're lined up against a wall and just machine gunned to death. And that's it for the royal family. I think their bodies were thrown down into a well or something near the area, and some remains are actually found in the last 20 years or so out there in Yekaterinburg and given royal burial and everything. But nonetheless, so with the communists in charge, Russia itself, remember they've pulled out of the war by 1917. They've signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but now Russia itself is going to fall into its own nasty, brutal civil war. The Red Army, or rather, the communists have their own secret police, the Cheka, who go around and launch this terrible terror campaign across Russia, grabbing up any type of enemies that they might find, basically anybody who is aligned with the royal family. And the lines are drawn, right? You're going to have the royal armies, the armies that either supported the Tsar or certainly at the very least don't support communism, and then of course the Red Army, the communists, and they're going to duke it out in this nasty civil war that goes on to the early 1920s. In the meantime, people like Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky are organizing the Soviet government, the Politburo, and trying to figure out, how this thing is really going to run, how they can get Russia on the right track. The Marxian track would be the right track to them. This is a lot of work. And the other issue is that Lenin, well, he dies. Lenin dies in 23, 24. And when he dies, well, there's a power vacuum. Guys like Leon Trotsky and rising up kind of out of nowhere from the behind the scenes, this guy Joseph Stalin, Joseph Saakashvili from Georgia, the country of Georgia. And basically he's able to align, political allies behind the scenes and kind of push out Trotsky and any others who are a threat to take over. And Stalin ends up rising to power by the end of the 1920s. And Lenin had actually warned the Soviet leadership of this guy Stalin. He basically said Stalin's a twit. He can't be trusted. No, this guy's not a future leader. But once Stalin comes in, he actually had these doctored photos made of him sitting next to Lenin like they were best buddies or whatever, but certainly not the case. But once Stalin comes in, he puts Russia on steroids of industrialization, or the Soviet Union on industrialization. And this is going to be a gargantuan Herculean effort to modernize, quote unquote, the Soviet Union, but it'll be at a huge human cost. Nonetheless, I mean, he is going to bring industrialization at the cost of who knows how many hundreds of thousands dead, but also he's going to run the gulags, some of the worst prison camps on the planet, where essentially people are arrested and sent to these gulags to dig up minerals or whatever for the state. Many of them die, Kolyma being one of the worst out in Siberia. Stalin also begins collectivization of the countryside, and millions are going to starve to death, especially in Ukraine. Ukraine actually tries to hold out against Stalin, so Stalin responds to that basically by shutting off Ukraine and starving people. And you have cannibalism all over Ukraine, and people just starving to death. So Stalin, not exactly a nice guy. And then in the mid to late 30s, he carries out what are called the purges, or the Great Purge, where he kills off, perhaps another 1 to 1.5 million other people who he perceived as political enemies in the Soviet Union. Okay, but the war itself, continuing on, so back to the war. So the British come up with this big strategic plan that they're going to try to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. They're going to do this, they believe, by landing at Gallipoli. And to land at Gallipoli, you can see the picture over there on your left. You can see the, as you come into the port, the harbor here, how there's very high lands around there. And the big British idea is to try to land the Anzacs, the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. So troops from Australia and New Zealand to try to take the beach there and establish, a bulwark, a front to take out the Ottomans. The problem is the Ottomans hold the high ground, and this is a total massacre. The Ottomans are able to drive off the British invasion forces, the Anzacs, and it's just a massacre. As a matter of fact, there's one guy who is in part of the decision making at the political level, government level for this, named Winston Churchill, and he was a big supporter of this invasion and almost destroys his political career. Luckily, that's not the case. One other big issue during this conflict, at least from the German standpoint, was that the United States, even though it proclaimed neutrality, was still sending supplies to the Allied forces across the Atlantic Ocean. And obviously then from the German standpoint, that means that the Germans simply couldn't sit back and allow their enemy to just be continually resupplied. So you get these German forces, these U-boats. They're going to be out sinking American ships, and invariably it's going to be unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans just indiscriminately sinking all these American ships that will eventually pull the U.S. into the war. The U.S. will declare war in April of 1917, as Woodrow Wilson says, to make the world safe for democracy. But this also is going to push the United States, as we said earlier, toward democracy itself, giving more women rights, for example, the right to vote. But nonetheless, you had German leaders like Admiral Holzendorf here, who promised the Kaiser Wilhelm II, not one American will land on the continent. Well, he was wrong. But it's the unrestricted submarine warfare, that's going to pull the U.S. into the war. And it's going to be part of turning the tide in this conflict on the Western Front. But some other things that go down, so you can see there on the left a German U-boat. U-boats weren't exactly, speedboats back then, right? They were very slow. It took time for them to ascend and descend. So they were pretty easily sinkable. Like if some people point out, for example, the Lusitania, which was sunk in May of 1915, it was a passenger ship. Well, why can't these U-boats send a warning? Well, the thing is that if these U-boats were to surface and say, we're going to sink you, but we'll let everybody get off, onto the life rafts. Well, the problem is a large ship like that could just ram the U-boat and sink it, basically, right? So, stealthiness and remaining hidden was really their biggest, most important strength and power. But some other things go down too. A month before the U.S. declares war, in March of 1917, this guy Arthur Zimmerman, a diplomat, German diplomat, Mexico, sends a telegram to the Mexican government saying that, hey, look, if you join us in this conflict, we'll make sure after we win that you get back all that territory you lost back in the 1840s, including places like California and Arizona, New Mexico, all that. That was taken from Mexico after the Mexican-American War, which was 1846 to 48. Problem is, Mexico is also in a world of hurt at this time. They're immersed in their own terrible revolution with tons of different leaders who briefly come to power, get assassinated, briefly come to power, get assassinated. So Mexico is in its own kind of mess. And in Mexico, they're trying to redistribute land, just like they do in the Soviet Union, just like they're doing in China once Mao comes into power. Anything to try to bring the peasants on board, bring the commoners on board, and bring calm. But the Mexican Revolution is going to spin out of control into the early 20s. By November of 1918, Germany is in really bad shape domestically, falling apart at the seams, partially due to the British blockade and lack of supplies. And then on the front lines, things not going as well. The Americans, they've been in the war by 1918 for a year. By November of 1918 anyway. So basically things fall apart. And on the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month, November 11th, Veterans Day in the United States today, Germany agrees to an armistice, an agreement to stop fighting. And the war, for all intents and purposes, is over. However, still have to work out the peace, make the formal treaty. An armistice is just an agreement to stop fighting. It's not an agreement to stop being at war. So essentially, the victors, the United States, Britain, France, and Italy thinks that they want to be in it too, but that doesn't go so well. Decide upon, creating this peace plan, and the peace plan is going to be hammered out in Versailles. And there's a big reason why that's happening. It's because Germany, when it united in 1871, you might recall that they threw their inaugural birthday party there in the Palace of Versailles. So this is France once again, getting even. So this kind of back and forth between Germany and France. But nonetheless, what these victors want to do, Wilson from the U.S., but most especially Clemenceau from France and David Lloyd George from England, Great Britain, they want to really punish Germany. France wants revenge, but they also want security. I mean, Germany, to be fair, Germany has invaded them a couple of times, big time, at this point in the last 50 years, right? But the Treaty of Versailles is going to officially end World War I, and basically it assigns sole blame upon the Central Powers, Austria and Germany. Now, of course, Austria-Hungary is obliterated by this conflict and will just become what is today Austria, and Germany is going to lose quite a bit of territory as well. But on top of that, Germany is going to have to pay reparations, damages for war, to the tune of about 32 to 33 billion dollars. There's no way that they're ever going to pay that off, right? But on top of that, Germany loses, like I said, a whole lot of territory, some territory even divided. They're not really allowed to have any type of major military force, just token defense forces. They have to change their government. The Kaiser is going to go. He's going to go live in, I think, in the Netherlands. So he's going to become more reclusive. He's no longer in charge. And the German people look at this and they're like, wow, this is pretty harsh. Because frankly, World War I, you have a lot of sides that could be blamed for this conflict. Germany certainly played a huge part of that, but the Allies certainly did as well. Britain and France anyway, especially France. But nonetheless, this treaty is going to really decimate the German economy. By 1923, the German government, known at this point as the Weimar government or republic, is just going to fall apart. The government itself is run by a lot of corrupt, decadent politicians, but on top of that, the economy just completely tanks. People's life savings are totally wiped out because the Deutschmark, their monetary unit, just totally crashes. So, if you had, say, 100,000 Deutschmarks in the bank for your retirement, now all of a sudden it's like 50 Pfennig or whatever they call the penny version. Because in other words, basically by 1923, one Deutschmark was worth the equivalent of about, or rather 50 million Deutschmarks was worth the equivalent of about a half US cent, right? Or a third US cent, something like that. In other words, the entire currency just crashes. It becomes more valuable to burn Deutschmarks for warmth than it is to exchange them for anything. So basically, Germany and its people are in terrible shape. And this becomes the fuel for the rise of the Nazi Party, Hitler. They're able to gain power off of this, kind of seeking revenge, getting even with the world. And this just kind of shows you the global theater then of this conflict. Just to give you more evidence of that this is a wide-reaching global war, world war. World War II will be even more so. Wait, there's going to be another war? I thought this was the peace for all time. Well, that's what Woodrow Wilson said. Wilson was convinced that he had the ultimate peace plan, his 14-point peace plan, where he thought that point number 14, he would create an international organization that would keep peace forever, known as the League of Nations, the League of Super Friends. In this League of Nations, Wilson had some ideas. One of his ideas, one of the 14 points, was something he called self-determination. This idea that nations of peoples should be able to have their own sovereignty and create their own country, basically, right? If you have a common identity, a common history, common culture as a people, then you deserve to have your own state. Well, people in China, people in Korea, people in the Middle East, Egypt, they rejoiced at this. They're like, oh my God, Woodrow Wilson, he understands us. Finally, somebody in the West understands that we don't need to be oppressed by Europeans anymore. The problem is Wilson wasn't talking about them. Wilson was a social Darwinist. We're talking about the guy that was the first to show Birth of a Nation in the White House, right, which is this film glorifying the KKK. Wilson is a total social Darwinist. He's not going to understand the plight of any of these non-European peoples. So basically, the whole kind of peace that he creates amongst the globe is very short-lived. People come to realize very quickly in these non-European places that Wilson is not speaking of them. So really the Great War becomes kind of the war to start all future wars, and the peace becomes the peace to assure that there will be no peace here. Now what these guys do partake in is dividing up Europe. They've got some pretty funny ideas about how to not only punish Germany, but assure that certain people in Europe regain or gain statehood. So basically these guys, when I say these guys, I mean Britain, France, and the United States, they basically sit down with maps of the Middle East, Ottoman Empire, former Ottoman Empire, Europe, and they just start drawing lines. And they create some new countries, as we'll see here in a minute. But the Ottoman Empire, of course, is vanquished. They will be no longer. They will be led by a guy named Mustafa Kemal. He's going to rise to power, the Young Turks, and they will form the country of Turkey out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. But the United States itself, so Wilson, his baby, his most important thing was this League of Nations. He thought that this was going to be an international body where these countries would come together and they would be able to arrive at a diplomatic resolution, peaceful resolution of any type of conflict could be resolved, short of going to war. Well, there's a couple of problems. The League of Nations will come into being. It's going to be dominated by Britain and France. So it kind of becomes to the rest of the world just another excuse for these imperial powers to control and manipulate global politics. But on top of that, the United States never joins the League of Nations. According to the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Senate has to ratify treaties. Well, for the Treaty of Versailles, the agreement was whoever signs the Treaty of Versailles is automatically enrolled into the League of Nations. It's kind of like one of those infomercials you see, and you think that you're buying this cheap plastic thing for $19.99 and just 3 easy payments, but you're also enrolled in a Jelly of the Month club. But nonetheless, the Senate, they read the fine print and they're like, no, we're not going to sign this treaty because we're not going to be part of the League of Nations, because to the Senate, from their standpoint, people like Henry Cabot Lodge, They look at it as we're not going to war for these Europeans any longer. And you have to put yourself from their perspective. The U.S. loses about 114,000 killed in this conflict. The U.S. fights in this war for all of about a year. I know that they declare war in April of 1917, but the reality is you don't actually have U.S. troops landing in Europe until November of that year, and then the war ends in November of the next year. So essentially, in a year of fighting, the U.S. loses well over 100,000 killed. So the Senate, they look at this and they say, well, we don't want anything to do with these, European wars. On top of that, during these treaty negotiations, they don't include the Soviet Union, right? Now, the Soviet Union is already skeptical about the ambitions of these capitalist imperialists. So basically, them not being invited to partake in the Treaty of Versailles just, draws the line even more. Oh, and then, by the way, the U.S., Britain, and France and some other countries send troops into the Soviet Union in hopes of trying to help the White Army defeat the Red Army. So U.S. troops never actually end up fighting. They just kind of freeze up in Siberia. But nonetheless, the Soviet Union understands that they're just not going to get along with the Western capitalist powers. So another terrible aspect of this conflict is something that goes on in the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, there is a mass extermination over the course of about 5 or 6 years of the Armenian peoples. It's just terrible. Well over 1 million, probably 1.5 million of these people who were just citizens, basically, but they weren't of the ethnic or religious orientation that was approved by the Ottoman Empire by this point, and mass graves start turning up all over, the Ottoman Empire, mostly in what is today Turkey. And the Armenian genocide, as any genocide is, of course, very controversial, but even more so because throughout history, Turkey has kind of denied that this happened, and that's been a very sticky issue with human rights groups, with the UN, and so on today. But the other big thing too is with the Ottoman Empire now gone, well, here come the imperial powers yet again. Remember, a root cause of World War I, maybe the root cause, was nationalism/imperialism, right? But they just can't help themselves. Basically, under the League of Nations, they set up what they call a mandate system. Basically, Britain and France are going to roll into the Middle East here, and they're going to oversee these places under these mandates. Basically, Britain and France didn't believe that the people of places like Syria, Palestine, modern-day Iraq, Jordan, they didn't think that these people were ready for democracy, to be able to rule themselves. So, Britain and France just had to kind of oversee things to make sure that, these people get the help that they need, right? This is more social Darwinism run amok as well, right? But basically, this becomes an excuse for, assuring that they get the people that they want in charge of these places. Modern-day Iraq didn't actually even exist. That's created by the British. They merged 3 different provinces that the Ottomans had always kept separate. They merge it into this country of Iraq. They put their guy, King Faisal, in charge so that British Petroleum can get some more oil at low prices to sell on the global market. The other thing, too, when you look over there at Europe, you notice there's some new countries on the map. This is the other thing that they do at the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson and the British and the French, Clemenceau and David Lloyd George's, they draw up some of these new countries. Yugoslavia comes onto the map, Czechoslovakia. You notice Hungary now becomes an independent country, separate of Austria. Poland is back on the map. And notice, too, all the territory taken away from Germany. You have Germany actually split there with the Polish corridor up at the Baltic Sea. You look over to the western side of Germany and you notice that France is actually occupying part of Germany, the Rhineland. So basically, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And it's going to be many of these things that are going to really drive the movement toward the Second World War. That and, of course, the global economy crashes with the Great Depression. But, you add up all those things and you're going to get a Second World War. And this, sadly, thanks to our friends at Wikipedia, shows us, just returning to the Armenian genocide for a moment, showing you, just how terrible this really was, where peoples were rounded up and deported to and all that. It's pretty terrible, and we still don't really know to this day, just how many were killed. Certainly, well above 1 million to 1.5 million, most likely. So the aftermath of this conflict, well, the war does usher in some changes, right? World War I basically makes governments bigger and makes their scope bigger. In other words, what they control or think that they need to control. So governments are going to be more robust. There's going to be a lot of anxieties about the modern world now after this conflict, right? I mean, this is modernity, machine guns and massacring millions of people. Yeah, kind of is, sadly, right? So that's going to be one of the harsh realities. And at the very end of the war, moving into 1919, this terrible flu pandemic breaks out. They call it the Spanish flu. Who called it the French flu? And it turns out it probably came from American barracks on the East Coast in the United States. But nonetheless, this wipes out up to 50 million people globally, this influenza, in about 1.5 to 2 years. Just terrible. In the United States alone, about 750,000 died from this great influenza of 1918, 1919, really 1919. Nonetheless, some other big changes. So, World War I also ushers in rights for women, as we pointed out a couple of times. Women are become increasingly liberated, not just because of the war, but the war certainly contributes by allowing women to have the right to vote and so on, which very much deserve, obviously, after all this time. But women, a little bit more free to express their sexuality in public, to get jobs, to go to school, things like this. Now, of course, they're still not going to be viewed as equals in many of these European and American societies. That's going to take, even more work, unfortunately, for women, with the civil rights movement of the 50s and the women's rights movement of the 50s and 60s as well. And you also get this lost generation. These artists, these writers, guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald, even Ernest Hemingway to an extent, who they begin to question, what is reality? What does the world really mean? Because there's just all this death and destruction. You have to understand, World War I is the worst war in human history by far at that point. That's why they called it the war to end all wars. There couldn't possibly be another war this terrible, this destructive, or so they thought, right? But nonetheless, it creates this kind of disillusionment amongst artists and writers. You see that reflected in their writing and in their art. For example, The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali, right? This painting is just this kind of montage of strange things. You see some insects crawling on pieces of time. You see some kind of weird half-human face here. But this kind of questioning of reality, this warping and bending of time, that perhaps time isn't even real, that, don't know if any of this is real, basically. And a lot of this is because of the harsh repercussions, psychological repercussions of this conflict. So overall, what are the consequences? Well, this whole European idea that they are superior is damaged. It's not destroyed yet. World War II will take care of that, but it's definitely into question, this whole social Darwinistic silliness and superiority of Europeans. Anti-colonial movements are going to be encouraged. They're not going to be able to be totally successful yet, but like I said, World War II will take care of that. A lot of social hierarchies in Europe, obviously, are going to be overthrown, radically altered. Just look at the Soviet Union, for example. And, it's obvious that increasingly states are needed to be more supportive of their own people. The governments actually should take care of the people whom they govern. Go figure. The war kind of shows that. And of course, we're going to have a lot of class-based conflict, especially in Europe, because the war just destroys infrastructure. It destroys people's lives, right? So you're going to have a lot of conflict between, those who still have wealth and those who do not. And socialism is going to become very popular. Communism is going to become very popular. I mean, so much so that it creates a country, right, in the Soviet Union. Of course, Karl Marx said that communism doesn't have a country, but nonetheless, these kind of notions of more socialistic governments, where the government has more power and more oversight over its people, become very popular, right? In Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy. And then, of course, these become totally warped in places like Italy and Germany, where we get kind of the opposite side of the spectrum of communism. We get fascism in places like Italy and Germany. And then other repercussions of the conflict, nationalism doesn't go away. It grows even stronger with the Great War in places like the entire African continent. You're going to have a lot of protests against, colonial governments there, European colonists, imperial powers. India. India also is greatly empowered by this conflict. They sacrifice quite a bit for the British Empire. But a lot of groups in India, including the Indian National Congress, realize that they need to modernize and industrialize for India's sake. And this is going to help kind of push India toward its independence movement, as we saw in previous power casts. And then, of course, the other idea that, do you use violence to gain this independence, or do you use peaceful protest? And some places we're going to see violent protest against colonial rule. But in other places like India, we're going to see people like Gandhi rise up and use this nonviolent protest to gain independence from European imperial rule. But you can see here, Europe after World War I, you can see all these new nations that come into play. And a lot of these places are carved out of former former Russian territory, former German territory. So, these territories that are taken or occupied or whatever are going to cause some major confrontation, arguments, disagreements that will really lay the foundation for the creation of the Second World War. And just an amazing political cartoon. This political cartoon was actually drawn in 1920, but what you see here is, it says, "The tiger. Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." When you look above the child's head, it says 1940 class. Well, the tiger is the guy that you see in the front of the picture carrying the walking stick there. That's Georges Clemenceau. He was the leader of France. And what this is depicting is the leaders of the Treaty of Versailles, that they're walking out of the conference, right? You see Clemenceau, the tall guy in the back there is Woodrow Wilson. You see Vittorio Orlando, the head of leader of Italy, and David Lloyd George there in the back. And David Lloyd George was one of the ones who made the comment that this was a peace built upon quicksand. In other words, this peace is going to basically sink into another war. And what this cartoonist was getting at is pretty remarkable. He's basically saying that, the kids who graduate by 1940, who are 18, 19, 20 years old, that they're going to be the ones fighting and dying in the next conflict. And just do the math. World War I ends in 1918. Ideal fighting age for someone, 20, 21, 22. Well, World War II starts in 1939. That's 21 years. So it's pretty amazing, the predictive power, I guess, that this cartoon had, but also that everybody kind of knew that the writing was on the wall for another conflict, and that World War I and really World War II are, in a sense, the same war. Thanks for tuning in, y'all.